August 23, 1939. In a Moscow conference room, two men sign a document that shocks the world. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Nazi Germany's Joachim von Ribbentrop, representatives of two ideologies that had publicly called each other mortal enemies, press their signatures to a non-aggression pact. The room erupts in champagne. Stalin himself reportedly toasted in honor of Adolf Hitler. The photograph will be reproduced in newspapers from London to Tokyo within 24 hours. The world calls it the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. What the world does not know, what the secret protocols buried within the agreement reveal, is that Germany and the Soviet Union have just divided Eastern Europe between themselves like a cartographer divides a blank map. Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, all allocated, all agreed upon. No shots fired, no battles required, just ink. History will record that this partnership lasted less than 2 years before Germany tore it apart on June 22, 1941, launching Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. That decision, historians have long argued, cost Germany the war. Hitler opened a front he could not close, stretched his armies across thousands of miles of Soviet territory, and handed Stalin the time, the space, and ultimately the Allied support he needed to survive. But what if that decision had never been made? What if, instead of betraying the Soviet Union, Hitler had maintained the partnership, or gone further? What if, in the spring of 1941, Germany and the Soviet Union had formalized a military alliance and turned their combined industrial capacity, their combined manpower, and their combined strategic intelligence against the Allied powers of Great Britain and, when the moment came, the United States? This is not a fantasy. It is a calculation, a study of logistics, geography, ideology, and the thin margins by which the Second World War was decided. Because the truth is this: in 1941, before the United States entered the war, before the Soviet war machine was fully mobilized, and before the British had recovered from the disasters of France and Dunkirk, a genuine German-Soviet alliance represented arguably the single most catastrophic scenario the Allied powers could have faced. Two of the three largest armies on Earth, two of the largest industrial economies, controlling landmass from the Atlantic coast of France to the Pacific shores of Siberia, united by a shared enemy. The question is not whether this was likely. The question is, what would have happened if it had occurred? And the answer, worked through strategy by strategy, theater by theater, year by year, is far more disturbing than most people have considered. This is the history of the war that almost was. And it begins not in 1941, but several years earlier, in the diplomatic calculations of two men who despised each other's ideology, but recognized each other's power. To understand why a German-Soviet military alliance was strategically plausible, even if politically improbable, one must first understand what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact actually was and what it was not. It was not friendship. Stalin did not trust Hitler. Hitler did not trust Stalin. The public ideological opposition between National Socialism and Soviet communism was real and deeply felt on both sides. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years portraying Bolshevism as an existential threat to European civilization. Soviet propaganda had returned the favor, identifying fascism as the terminal stage of capitalist imperialism. Their followers had shot and beaten each other in the streets of Berlin and Munich throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And yet, in the summer of 1939, ideology was temporarily subordinated to geopolitics. Both powers wanted things the other could provide. Germany wanted to avoid a two-front war. Stalin wanted buffer territory in Eastern Europe and time to rebuild the Red Army, which had been decimated by his own purges of the officer corps. Purges that had eliminated an estimated 35,000 officers between 1937 and 1938. The pact gave both men what they needed in the short term. What it also revealed, and what is essential for any counterfactual analysis, is that the strategic interests of Germany and the Soviet Union were not, in the medium term, irreconcilable. Both states were revisionist powers. Both opposed the Anglo-French imperial order that had structured Europe since Versailles. Both had been excluded from the liberal international order, and both, in their different ways, sought its destruction. The German military establishment understood this better than Hitler did. Several senior officers, including figures within the Abwehr, German military intelligence, privately argued in the late 1930s that a durable partnership with the Soviet Union, rather than a war against it, represented Germany's best path to long-term dominance. The logic was straightforward. Germany, with Soviet raw materials, particularly oil, grain, and strategic metals, would be economically self-sufficient and therefore blockade-proof. The British strategy of economic strangulation, which had proved decisive in the First World War, would be neutralized. This analysis was not wrong. Between September 1939 and June 1941, while the pact held, Germany and the Soviet Union engaged in extensive trade. The Soviets delivered over 1 million tons of grain, significant quantities of oil, manganese, chrome, and platinum. In return, Germany provided industrial equipment, technical expertise, and military technology, including a cruiser, the Rupture, transferred to the Soviet Navy. Both economies benefited. And critically, British naval pressure on German trade routes was substantially weakened by Soviet supply deliveries that arrived overland and by Soviet-controlled ports. Now imagine that arrangement not merely continuing, but deepening. Imagine a formal military component added to the economic relationship. Imagine Soviet forces not merely supplying Germany, but coordinating with German forces against a common set of objectives. The question becomes, what would those objectives be? Where would the alliance choose to strike? And how would the Allied powers, principally Great Britain, respond to an enemy they had never planned for and never trained against? The strategic map in 1941 contains the answer, and it is a map that should give anyone studying it a moment of cold reflection. Military planners operate on a principle known as the correlation of forces. Before any operation begins, they assess the balance of strength, mobility, supply, and geography between opposing sides. Apply that principle to a hypothetical German-Soviet alliance in 1941, and the correlation of forces becomes almost incomprehensible in its asymmetry. Begin with manpower. The Wehrmacht in the spring of 1941 numbered approximately 7.3 million men. The Red Army, despite the devastation of the purges, had been rebuilt to a standing force of approximately 5.4 million, with millions more available through rapid mobilization. Together, the two militaries would have fielded a combined active force of roughly 13 million men. The entire British armed forces at that time numbered fewer than 4 million, spread across multiple theaters from the North Atlantic to the Middle East to the Far East. The United States, still officially neutral, had an army of barely 1.5 million troops, poorly equipped, undertrained, and nowhere near ready for major combat operations. Then consider armor. German panzer forces in 1941 comprised approximately 5,200 tanks, including the formidable Panzer III and IV models. Soviet armored forces, despite their organizational problems, fielded over 22,000 tanks, including the T-34, which was technically superior to almost everything in the German inventory. Combined, the two powers would have controlled roughly 27,000 armored vehicles. The British Army in 1941 had fewer than 5,000 tanks total, many of them mechanically unreliable and poorly armored. Air power tells a similar story. The Luftwaffe's operational strength in 1941 stood at approximately 3,500 combat aircraft. Soviet air forces, again despite doctrinal and organizational problems, numbered over 10,000 aircraft. The Royal Air Force, bloodied by the Battle of Britain, had roughly 2,500 frontline aircraft. Exhausted, under-resourced, and defending a home island now surrounded by hostile coastline from Norway to France. But raw numbers do not win wars alone. The critical question for the alliance planners would have been where to strike and in what sequence. The primary strategic objective would have been the elimination of Great Britain as an active combatant. British naval power was the engine of Allied resistance. Without it, the Atlantic supply lines to Britain would be severed, American material support for Britain would have no delivery mechanism, and the Mediterranean theater, vital for British access to Middle Eastern oil, would collapse. The German Navy had already developed plans for a Mediterranean strategy. Admiral Erich Raeder had repeatedly argued that Gibraltar, Malta, and Suez, the three keystones of British Mediterranean power, should be taken before any attack on the Soviet Union. Hitler had partially agreed, but had never committed the forces to execute the plan. In the counterfactual, with Soviet cooperation, the plan becomes executable. Here is how the strategic sequence would have looked. Phase 1. The combined Axis and Soviet economic partnership is formalized into a military alliance in late 1940 or early 1941. Germany agrees not to press for ideological conformity in Soviet-controlled territories. The Soviets agree to provide raw materials and, critically, to enter a coordinated campaign in the Middle East and Central Asia. Phase 2. German and Italian forces, reinforced by Luftwaffe units no longer committed to the Eastern Front, drive through North Africa toward Egypt. The goal as Suez. Phase 3. Soviet forces move through Iran and Iraq, both of which Britain nominally controlled, threatening Basra and the Persian Gulf oil fields. Phase 4. Combined naval and air pressure on Britain intensifies, potentially forcing a negotiated settlement or collapse. The strategic logic is coherent. The resource base is sufficient. The military correlation of forces favors the alliance at every point of anticipated contact. What would prevent execution? The answer lies not in military mathematics, but in politics, and in the fundamental distrust between the two regimes that no formal treaty could fully resolve. Understanding that fault line is essential to understanding how and why the alliance would have been both potent and fragile. In the actual history of the Second World War, the North African campaign was a sideshow, a significant sideshow, one that consumed enormous British resources and ultimately paved the way for the Allied invasion of Italy in 1943. But a sideshow nonetheless, decided by Rommel's supply problems and the eventual weight of American material power. In the counterfactual, North Africa becomes the decisive theater. Consider the position in the autumn of 1941 under the assumption that Operation Barbarossa never occurred. Rommel's Africa Corps is no longer starved of reinforcement. The Luftwaffe units committed to the Eastern Front in the actual war. Hundreds of transport aircraft, fighter squadrons, and dive bombers remain available for Mediterranean operations. Malta, the island fortress that interdicted Axis supply lines to Libya throughout the actual war, can now be subjected to sustained aerial assault without the simultaneous demand of air power over Leningrad and Stalingrad. Malta's fall was nearly achieved in the spring and summer of 1942 in the actual war, when Axis air attacks reduced the island's defensive capacity to the point where the British garrison could barely function. The actual relief of Malta came at enormous cost. Operation Pedestal in August 1942 saw 14 merchant vessels dispatched and only 5 arrive. In the counterfactual, with a Luftwaffe not yet depleted over the Soviet Union, Malta falls. The supply lane to Rommel's forces becomes secure. The drive to Suez, which in the actual war was halted at El Alamein in late 1942, proceeds. The capture of Suez would have been more than a military victory. It would have been a strategic catastrophe for Britain of the First Order. The Suez Canal was the artery through which Britain accessed its empire. Indian troops, Australian divisions, New Zealand forces, all flowed through Suez. So did oil from Iraq and Iran. The Royal Navy's ability to operate in the Eastern Mediterranean depended on the canal remaining open. Without it, Britain's global strategic position collapses into a series of isolated garrisons, each fighting a defensive war without mutual support. Now add the Soviet component, Soviet forces entering Iran, as they actually did briefly in 1941 in cooperation with Britain in the real war, ironically. But in this scenario, moving as part of a hostile alliance rather than a friendly one. The Soviet occupation of northern Iran was a historical reality, the extension of that presence southward toward Basra and the Persian Gulf oil fields under the pressure of a coordinated Axis Soviet campaign is not historically implausible. It merely required a different political alignment to execute. The British position in Iraq and Iran in 1941 was precarious. The Anglo-Iraqi War of May 1941, which occurred in actual history, demonstrated that Britain's control of Iraq was contested, requiring an emergency military operation to suppress a pro-Axis coup. With Soviet forces applying pressure from the north and German forces advancing from the southwest, the British position in the Middle East would have been untenable. The loss of Middle Eastern oil would have been decisive. Britain imported the majority of its oil from the Persian Gulf through 1941 and 1942. American oil supplies were available, but the tanker tonnage required to deliver them across the Atlantic under U-boat attack was already stretched beyond sustainable limits. Remove Middle Eastern supply and British oil reserves, last at 1941 consumption rates, approximately 6 months. 6 months of fuel for warships, aircraft, and armored vehicles. 6 months before the Royal Navy begins losing operational capacity. But the Mediterranean campaign is only one axis of pressure. The second, and in many ways the more strategically decisive, runs through the Atlantic. And here, the German-Soviet alliance changes the naval equation in ways that historians have rarely fully appreciated. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War. From the first day of hostilities in September 1939 to the final German surrender in May 1945, the struggle for control of the North Atlantic shipping lanes never ceased. German U-boats sank over 3,500 Allied merchant vessels. Allied aircraft, escorts, and technological developments, particularly radar, code-breaking at Bletchley Park, and the development of effective anti-submarine weapons, eventually turned the tide. By mid-1943, the U-boat campaign was defeated. In the counterfactual, several of those decisive Allied advantages are removed or substantially weakened. The first and most significant is the intelligence advantage. The British success at Bletchley Park, at decoding German naval communications via the Enigma machine, was one of the most consequential intelligence operations in history. It allowed Allied convoys to route around U-boat wolf packs with remarkable effectiveness once the operational systems were working by 1941 and 1942. But Enigma was a German system. The Soviet Union's communications used entirely different encryption architecture. In a coordinated German-Soviet naval campaign, the Soviets would have contributed submarines. The Soviet Navy operated over 170 submarines in 1941, a substantial fleet, and Soviet naval communications would have been opaque to British intelligence. The Bletchley advantage would apply to German signals, but not to Soviet ones. The second change concerns geography. Soviet submarines operating from bases in the Arctic, Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, could have extended the U-boat campaign's operational reach into areas of the North Atlantic that the German Navy found difficult to sustain. The Arctic convoys, which in actual history ran as Allied supply routes to the Soviet Union and were savagely attacked by German forces, would in the counterfactual have been Soviet attack corridors rather than Allied supply routes. The entire northern flank of the Atlantic battle would have been under hostile naval pressure. The third change is raw tonnage. The German U-boat fleet, for all its lethality, was always limited by production capacity. The Admiral Karl Dönitz's tonnage war, the strategy of sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, came close to succeeding but ultimately fell short because American shipbuilding, once mobilized after Pearl Harbor, outproduced German sinkings. In the counterfactual, Soviet submarines add to the total rate of Allied ship sinkings, compressing the margin even further. And then there is the question of American entry into the war. In the actual history, the United States was brought into the war by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and by Germany's subsequent declaration of war on the United States, a decision Hitler made that remains one of the most analytically puzzling choices of the war. Under no strategic compulsion to do so, he handed Roosevelt the justification for a full two-ocean war commitment that America had been avoiding. In the counterfactual, Japan's position becomes a central variable. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, signed in April 1941, which Stalin signed partly to secure his eastern flank before the German threat he anticipated, remains in effect in this scenario. Japan, relieved of the threat of Soviet attack on Manchuria, is even more likely to move southward into the Pacific and Southeast Asia, targeting British and Dutch colonial possessions. The question is whether Japan attacks the United States directly, and whether the political conditions for American entry into a German-Soviet war against Britain exist. In 1941 and 1942, American public opinion was deeply divided on entry into the European war. The interventionist faction, led by figures like Roosevelt himself, and driven by the conviction that a Europe dominated by Nazi Germany threatened American security, was powerful but not dominant. The isolationist movement was large, vocal, and institutionally entrenched. Without the galvanizing shock of Pearl Harbor, without the German declaration of war on the United States, the political conditions for full American military commitment to Britain's defense were uncertain at best. A Britain already facing Mediterranean collapse, oil shortages, and an intensified Atlantic campaign would have been negotiating from a position of catastrophic weakness before American forces were ready to deploy in meaningful numbers. And that calculation leads to the most uncomfortable question the counterfactual raises. Every alliance in history carries within it the seeds of its own dissolution. The Grand Alliance of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, which ultimately defeated Germany, was riddled with distrust, competing imperial interests, and ideological incompatibility. Churchill despised communism. Stalin suspected British manipulation at every turn. Roosevelt's vision of a post-war international order clashed with Soviet territorial ambitions in Eastern Europe. The alliance held because all three partners shared a single overriding objective: the destruction of Nazi Germany. A German-Soviet alliance would have been held together by a correspondingly powerful shared interest: the destruction of British imperial power and the revision of the Versailles-era international order. But beneath that shared interest, the sources of tension were profound and, almost certainly, eventually fatal. The first tension was ideological. Hitler's core racial ideology was not merely an attitude. It was the organizing principle of the Nazi state. His view of Slavic peoples as racially inferior, as Untermenschen, was not a political position he could easily moderate without undermining the legitimacy of his own regime. Even in the actual Molotov-Ribbentrop period, German racial ideology created friction at every level of the bilateral relationship. Nazi propaganda could not simply stop describing Soviets as racially subordinate. Soviet intelligence was acutely aware of German designs on Soviet territory for future colonization. The ideological ceasefire required for the alliance to function was always temporary in the minds of both leaderships. The second tension was territorial. The German long-term objective, as expressed in Mein Kampf, in Hitler's table talk, in the directives of the SS Planungsamt, was the acquisition of Lebensraum in the East. Living space for the German people, to be settled by German colonists after the displacement and elimination of the existing Slavic population. This objective was not a wartime improvisation. It was foundational to the Nazi worldview. Any alliance with the Soviet Union necessarily postponed, but could not abolish that objective. Stalin knew this. His intelligence services had access to the translated texts. He understood, as he confided to close associates, that Hitler's partnership was a tactical arrangement, not a strategic conversion. The third tension was economic. The logic of a German-Soviet alliance rested heavily on complementary resource endowments, Soviet raw materials in exchange for German industrial products. But the terms of that exchange were always contested. German industrialists wanted favorable pricing. Soviet planners wanted technology transfers, particularly in precision manufacturing and aviation. The actual trade negotiations between 1939 and 1941 were contentious, with both sides accusing the other of failing to deliver agreed quantities. In a deeper, longer-term alliance, those disputes would have scaled proportionally. The fourth tension was geopolitical. The division of spheres of influence negotiated in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was always imprecise at the margins. Romania, source of critical oil at Ploiești that Germany depended on, was within the German sphere but bordered Soviet-controlled territories in ways that created friction. Finland resisted Soviet absorption. Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, which Germany occupied in the spring of 1941 in the actual war, were regions where Soviet and German interests competed. A military alliance would have required constant renegotiation of spheres as the military situation evolved. Perhaps most fundamentally, the fifth tension was the question of who would dominate the post-war order. If the alliance succeeded in defeating Britain and forcing an American strategic withdrawal from Europe, the next question was immediate and unavoidable. Who controlled what, and on what terms? A Europe under German hegemony and an Asia-Pacific under Soviet and Japanese influence presented a world where two totalitarian systems would inevitably compete for the marginal territories between them. Persia, Turkey, the Balkans, Scandinavia. The war against the Allies, if successful, would not end international conflict. It would restructure it. This is the historical paradox at the heart of the counterfactual. The very success of the alliance would have accelerated its collapse. Victory against Britain would have removed the external pressure that held the partnership together and exposed all the internal contradictions that made it inherently unstable. The question is not whether the German-Soviet alliance would eventually have broken apart. The question is whether it would have broken apart before or after Britain was forced to make peace. The British government in 1940 and 1941, under Winston Churchill, operated on the explicit strategic assumption that survival required two things: holding out long enough for the United States to enter the war and maintaining the Soviet Union as a counterweight against German power in the East. Both assumptions were correct in the actual war. Both would have been invalidated by the counterfactual. Churchill had been prepared to negotiate with Germany in the summer of 1940, or at least the possibility had been discussed at the highest levels of the British War Cabinet. The Halifax-Churchill debates of May 1940, now partially declassified, reveal that Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax seriously proposed opening peace feelers through Mussolini. Churchill shut down the discussion, arguing that any negotiated peace would deliver Britain into German dependency and ultimately German control. He prevailed. Britain fought on. But Churchill's willingness to fight on rested on a calculation that the United States would eventually enter the war, that Germany would overextend itself, and that some combination of these factors would allow Britain to regain the strategic initiative. Strip those assumptions away, as the counterfactual does, and the calculation changes. By early 1942, in the counterfactual scenario, the position would have been as follows. British oil reserves critically depleted. The Suez Canal lost or under direct threat. The Atlantic supply route under unprecedented dual pressure from German and Soviet naval forces. American military deployment not yet begun in significant numbers. The Royal Air Force and Royal Navy still formidable, but fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts against an enemy with effectively unlimited manpower and a secured economic base. Under those conditions, the question of British political endurance becomes genuinely uncertain. Churchill himself was not immortal as a political figure. His authority rested on the conviction that the war was winnable and that suffering had a purpose. A Britain facing irreversible strategic deterioration, not the existential but survivable crisis of the Blitz, but a slow, grinding loss of strategic assets and economic capacity, would have generated enormous political pressure for a negotiated settlement. The British public, which endured years of hardship in the actual war on the understanding that victory was coming, might not have sustained that same endurance under conditions where victory became increasingly difficult to envision. The governments of Canada, Australia, and South Africa, nominally independent dominions whose participation in the war was significant, were not bound to fight indefinitely if Britain itself sought terms. Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King had always been cautious about Canadian commitments to European conflicts. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin had already, by late 1941 in the actual war, begun to reorient Australian strategic thinking toward the United States and the Pacific, rather than toward British-led operations in Europe and the Middle East. A negotiated British peace, not a German-dictated surrender, but a settlement that preserved British sovereignty and the Empire in exchange for withdrawing from the European continent and acknowledging German hegemony there, was within the realm of political possibility under sufficiently extreme circumstances. It would not have been the outcome Churchill wanted. It would have been the outcome a Britain without American engagement and without the Eastern Front drawing German power away could not indefinitely resist. And then there is the American question, because even if Britain made peace, the United States would eventually have had to confront the strategic reality of a world dominated by a German-Soviet axis. The question was not whether America would eventually respond. The question was from what position. Franklin Roosevelt understood what a German victory in Europe would mean for the United States more clearly and earlier than most of his contemporaries. His Lend-Lease proposal of early 1941, which provided Britain with weapons and supplies without requiring immediate payment, was an act of strategic calculation disguised as generosity. Roosevelt knew that a Britain that survived was America's forward defensive line. A Britain that fell was a Britain whose navy, whose colonial ports, and whose strategic territories became assets available to a German-led European empire. The implications for the Western Hemisphere were not hypothetical. A Germany with secure control of the Eastern Atlantic, with naval bases in France, Norway, and potentially in captured British territories in West Africa, would have been able to project power into the South Atlantic in ways that threatened American trade routes to South America and access to critical raw materials in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. The Monroe Doctrine would have been facing its first serious challenge since its formulation. American military planners in the early 1940s had, in fact, gamed scenarios remarkably similar to this one. War Plan Orange addressed the Pacific, but Rainbow 5, the most comprehensive American strategic plan of the period, addressed a scenario of European Axis domination combined with Japanese aggression in the Pacific. It required the United States to fight a two-ocean war against enemies who had already consolidated their positions. The conclusion of Rainbow Five was unambiguous. The United States needed to begin a massive military build-up immediately and needed British survival as a prerequisite for any successful strategy. Without British survival, the American strategic calculus changes entirely. American rearmament had begun in earnest by 1940, accelerated by Roosevelt's leadership and the shock of the fall of France. By 1943, American industrial production was becoming the decisive factor in the actual war. But military production alone is not a strategy. A military that has been mobilized needs forward bases, secure supply lines, allied infrastructure, and trained forces to project power. In the counterfactual, by 1943, Britain has made peace. There are no allied bases in the United Kingdom. There is no air bridge from which to launch strategic bombing campaigns over Germany. There is no staging ground for an eventual land campaign in Europe. An America fighting from its own shores, or from Canada and Caribbean territories, against a German empire that controls the European coastline from the North Cape of Norway to the Strait of Gibraltar, is not fighting from a position of strength. It is fighting a holding action, a defensive war. A war with no clear path to decisive victory in Europe because Europe is inaccessible without the very island base that has been lost. This does not mean an American defeat. The United States, protected by two oceans, possessing enormous industrial capacity and facing no credible threat of land invasion, could sustain an indefinite defensive posture. But not defeated is not the same as victorious. And a Germany that has secured European hegemony, that controls the resources of the continent from the Atlantic to the Urals, in coordination with Soviet resources extending further east, is not a Germany that the United States can quickly or easily dislodge. The more likely outcome, on honest strategic analysis, is a protracted period of armed standoff. A Cold War of a different kind. Two great power blocks. The German-Soviet axis controlling Eurasia, and the United States controlling the Western Hemisphere and potentially the Pacific in alliance with China and other powers, facing each other across the Atlantic. Neither able to destroy the other, both expending resources and energy on maintaining the boundary between them. Unless the internal contradictions of the German-Soviet alliance, which we have already examined, finally resolve themselves in the form that both Stalin and Hitler always privately anticipated, a war between them. History does not offer a precedent for a long-term ideologically coherent alliance between National Socialism and Soviet communism. What it does offer is a pattern. Revolutionary powers that cooperate against a common enemy will, once that enemy is neutralized, revert to competing against each other. This was true of the Bolsheviks and the various socialist factions they cooperated with during the Russian Revolution. It was true of the Allied powers themselves, whose wartime partnership dissolved almost immediately into the Cold War once Germany and Japan were defeated. The German-Soviet alliance, if it succeeded in neutralizing British power, would have faced exactly this dynamic. The timing of the rupture is the critical variable. Based on the pattern of actual German planning and Hitler's known ideological commitments, it is difficult to argue that the alliance would have held beyond the middle of the 1940s. The same generals who planned Barbarossa in the actual war, and who had been planning it since 1940, would have continued to advocate for an eventual reckoning with the Soviet Union. The same elements within the SS and the Nazi Party that defined the German national project in terms of Eastern colonization would not have abandoned that objective simply because it was temporarily inconvenient. Stalin, for his part, would have been using the alliance period to rebuild and modernize the Red Army. The same process he was actually pursuing throughout 1941 and 1942. Funded partly by Lend-Lease, but primarily by Soviet domestic production. In the counterfactual, without the catastrophic losses of Barbarossa, the Red Army would have entered the mid-1940s in substantially better shape. Officer corps intact, equipment modernized, doctrine reformed. it would not have been the shattered, desperate institution that retreated in disarray in the summer of 1941. When the inevitable rupture came, and the historical and strategic evidence suggests it would have come, it would have been between two militaries in far more balanced condition than in the actual 1941. The German military, undepleted by 4 years of Eastern Front combat, would have been stronger than the Wehrmacht that exhausted itself at Moscow and Stalingrad. The Soviet military, undefeated in its initial campaign and continuously modernized, would have been stronger than the Red Army that survived Barbarossa through sheer human cost. The resulting German-Soviet war, the war that Hitler always intended but chose to fight under historically disadvantageous conditions, would have been the largest military conflict in human history by an even greater margin than the actual Eastern Front. Two fully mobilized industrial superpowers, each with its sphere of control secured, each with years of preparation, fighting for dominance over the Eurasian landmass. The outcome of that conflict is genuinely uncertain. In the actual war, the Soviet Union prevailed over Germany largely because of three factors: American Lend-Lease supply, which provided millions of vehicles, millions of tons of food and critical industrial equipment; the strategic bombing campaign that forced Germany to divert resources to air defense; and the geographic depth of Soviet territory, which allowed tactical defeats to be traded for strategic survival. In the counterfactual German-Soviet war, American Lend-Lease would likely flow to whichever side offered more strategic benefit, and with Britain neutralized, the United States would have had powerful incentives to support whichever power appeared weaker, as a means of prolonging the conflict and ensuring neither achieved decisive dominance. A Eurasian war of that scale, fought by powers that had both demonstrated willingness to inflict extraordinary suffering on civilian populations, would have generated casualties that dwarf even the actual Second World War. The 27 million Soviet dead of the actual war. The estimated German military and civilian losses of between 7 and 9 million. Multiply those figures by the increased scale of the forces involved, the longer operational timelines, and the absence of outside intervention to force a decisive resolution. It is at this point in the counterfactual that the moral weight of what is being analyzed becomes fully apparent, because the world that emerges from this scenario, even if American power eventually imposes some form of resolution, is a world of comprehensively greater human destruction than the world that actually occurred. And that fact leads directly to the most disturbing conclusion of the entire analysis. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the United States detonated the first nuclear weapon in history. The Manhattan Project, begun in 1942, and ultimately employing over 130,000 people at a cost of approximately $2 billion, had been driven by specific fear that Germany would develop the weapon first. That fear was not irrational. Germany had begun its own nuclear program, the Uranverein, or Uranium Club, in 1939, with a strong group of physicists that included Werner Heisenberg and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. German nuclear research ultimately failed to produce a weapon for several interconnected reasons. Allied bombing that disrupted the heavy water supply at Vemork in Norway. The emigration of Jewish scientists, many of whom ended up contributing to the Manhattan Project, who had been driven from German universities by Nazi racial laws. Organizational fragmentation and underfunding, and a fundamental miscalculation by Heisenberg about the critical mass required for a chain reaction. In the counterfactual, some of those factors change. A Germany not committed to a massive Eastern Front campaign has substantially more industrial and scientific resources available for weapons development programs. The heavy water facility at Vemork, if Malta falls and British strategic bombing capacity is reduced by the Mediterranean campaign, faces less Allied pressure. The organizational competition between different German scientific and military agencies that hindered actual German nuclear research might be resolved differently under a leadership that understood the stakes. The Soviet nuclear program, which in the actual war was substantially accelerated by intelligence gathered from the Manhattan Project through Soviet spies including Klaus Fuchs, Julius Rosenberg, and others, would in the counterfactual have had different intelligence access. The Manhattan Project, responding to a different strategic situation, might have proceeded at a different pace. Soviet physicists like Igor Kurchatov, who were world-class scientists, would have continued their own research programs. The question of which power develops nuclear weapons first, in the counterfactual, is genuinely open. And it matters enormously because the use or threat of nuclear weapons by any of the major actors in the scenario, Germany against the Soviet Union against Germany, the United States against either, would have transformed the strategic calculations in ways that are difficult to model and impossible to predict with confidence. What is clear is this: the counterfactual world of 1945 or 1946 is one in which nuclear weapons are being developed by at least two powers, possibly three, in a strategic environment of active conflict or armed tension between major powers. That environment, nuclear development under conditions of major power warfare, represents a qualitatively different and more dangerous proliferation scenario than the one that actually occurred, where the United States had a brief nuclear monopoly in a post-war period, however imperfect. The historical lesson here is not comforting. The actual nuclear peace, the fact that nuclear weapons have not been used in combat since Nagasaki in August 1945, depended on a specific and somewhat fortuitous sequence of events. American development first, use against Japan before any other power had the weapon, and then a Cold War deterrence framework that, however terrifying, held. In the counterfactual, that sequence does not exist. The deterrence framework has to be constructed under conditions of active warfare between nuclear-armed or near-nuclear-armed states. That is a world from which no confident prediction of survival can be derived. Return now to that Moscow conference room in August 1939. Molotov and Ribbentrop, the champagne, Stalin's toast to Hitler, the secret protocols carving up Eastern Europe. History records that what began there ended in catastrophe. Not the catastrophe of a successful German-Soviet alliance against the Allies, but the catastrophe of its betrayal. Barbarossa killed 27 million Soviet citizens. It killed between 7 and 9 million Germans. It burned cities that had stood for centuries. It created the conditions for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in the Nazi death camps. A genocide made possible by German control of Eastern European territory that would not have been acquired, or at least not at the same pace, under a genuine partnership with the Soviet Union. The counterfactual teaches something important precisely because it reveals how much worse things could plausibly have been. The actual Second World War, with its approximately 70 to 85 million deaths, is the defining catastrophe of the 20th century. The counterfactual scenario, analyzed honestly, suggests the possibility of a conflict that could have exceeded those figures, not through any single act of brutality, but through the grinding weight of a longer, larger, more evenly matched series of conflicts extending through the 1940s and potentially into the 1950s. It also reveals the degree to which the Allied victory was not inevitable. It required the specific decision of Adolf Hitler to betray a partnership that was, by military and economic metrics, working in Germany's favor. It required that decision to be made in June 1941, when Germany was still at the height of its power, before the attrition of the actual war had begun to tell. And it required the subsequent resilience of the Soviet Union, a resilience purchased at staggering human cost, to turn that decision into Germany's fatal mistake. History does not move on rails, it moves on contingency, on the decisions of individuals made under pressure, often for reasons that have as much to do with ideology and psychology as with strategic calculation. Hitler's decision to launch Barbarossa was driven in significant part by ideological conviction. by the belief, fundamental to his worldview, that the Soviet state was a Jewish Bolshevist construction that would collapse under military pressure like a rotten door. That conviction was wrong. The door did not collapse, and that error cost the Third Reich everything. The German-Soviet alliance never came to pass in the way this analysis has examined, not because it was impossible, but because one man's ideology made it psychologically impossible for him to sustain. The world survived in the form it took, partly because Adolf Hitler could not maintain a partnership with people his ideology required him to view as subhuman. That is not a comfort, that is a warning. The lesson of the road not taken is not that the Allies were destined to win. It is that they were fortunate to face an enemy whose ideological commitments eventually overrode his strategic competence. In a different moment, with a different leader, the calculation might have been made differently. The alliance might have been deepened rather than betrayed. And the war that followed might have been one from which no clear victor emerged, and no clear moral accounting was possible. We live in the world that actually happened. 70 to 85 million people died to produce it. The least we can do is understand, as precisely as we can, how close it came to being something considerably worse. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions, keep seeking the truth,